Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
On behalf of the North Idaho College Public Forum and Idaho Public Television, I'm pleased to welcome you to an interview with the distinguished Mr. Juan Williams. Many of you certainly are familiar with him. He's a senior correspondent for National Public Radio, as well as a political analyst for Fox Television. He's a former award-winning columnist and editorial writer for the Washington Post and was a White House correspondent. He's the author of 6 books, including the one titled Eyes on the Prize, and also one called Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary. Mr. Williams, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our program. We've heard you many times, and you're very gracious to take this time with us.
Tony, it's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to have 2 panelists to interview our guest today. First is Dr. Virginia Johnson, who is the chair of the North Idaho College Division of Communications, Fine Arts, and the Humanities, and in 1987, she received the National Community College Teacher of the Year Award. Welcome, Virginia.
Thank you, Tony.
I'm equally very pleased to have on the program Ron Pizanowski, who is the Director of Broadcasting for Idaho Public Television. And Ron, I want to say to you and Peter Morley, it's been a pleasure working with you. You have a great, great station, and you are the one station that ties all of Idaho together, and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And we will start the questioning with Virginia Johnson.
Mr. Williams, you're, of course, very well known for your work with civil rights and your books about them, and I have a couple of them today, and I wanted to ask you regarding these books, including My Soul Looks Back in Wonder, which is a wonderful collection of interviews and essays about civil rights people and people who've had experiences with civil rights. What are the specific events in your life or your education that made you start studying and become really interested in working with civil rights?
Well, Virginia, without giving too much away, I was born in 1954. And I think that's kind of an auspicious year because if you'll recall, 54 is the year of the Brown decision that starts so much of the modern civil rights movement because the Brown decision orders desegregation of America's public schools. And then you go through many sort of important events with regard to that. Think about it, we're now 50 years after Little Rock at Central High, where they had 9 black children try to integrate that school and meet with such opposition. And then you go forward from that, and of course you go through things like the Great March on Washington in '63, the Civil Rights Act of '64, voting rights in '65. In this political year, something like that really stands as a monumental achievement. So here I was as a little boy growing up, and this is the news in the world around me. And Dr. King, of course, was a major iconic figure even then, a Nobel Peace Prize winner on TV, and where he went was where the TV camera went, charting the course of the civil rights movement. So for me, this was, and I must say, even as a young black boy in New York City, in Brooklyn, New York, just on the street corner, there was all sorts of, different twists and turns to this story. You could run into people who were there as activists in terms of groups like the NAACP, but also people who were there who were more radicalized, people who were involved with the Black Muslims, the Nation of Islam, and people who were celebrating the defiance of Malcolm X or the Black Panthers. It was all around me. So there was a fascination. I was too young an age really to be an actor in the 60s, but in terms of understanding that there was a panorama of events and personalities that was shaping history, I think I had that appreciation at a young age.
Interesting. Thanks.
Ron, please.
So this year is obviously a historical year with an election, major party candidate born to a black father and from Kenya and a white mother from Kansas. And so in light of what you were saying, how much do you think the changing demographics has contributed to Barack Obama's acceptance as the Democratic candidate for president versus how much you think is sort of a natural extension of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s?
Well, that's a tough one, Ron. I mean, of course it's an extension. I mentioned in passing earlier in talking with Virginia about the 1965 Voting Rights Act. I mean, it's hard to remember, but people were denied the right to vote, and specifically African Americans, right. So that there had to be government enforcement of the idea that every American should have that franchise, that right to vote. So you couldn't have black politics really before 65 in this country. You had some sporadic people in Congress or occasionally local officials, but it was pretty much a rarity as compared to today, where you have like 40-something members of the Congress who are members of the Congressional Black Caucus, or I think it's a 20-something who are members of the Hispanic Caucus. That's unprecedented in American history, and it's a function of the fact that you have minority voting rights in the country. And then you come to something like Barack Obama, and Barack Obama is interesting to me because he's literally a new generation. He's next generation, if you will. He does not come out of the civil rights movement. He doesn't come out of the black pulpit. He comes out of a generation of someone who's gone to Columbia University, Harvard Law School, editor of the Harvard Law Review, someone who I think represents sort of a global perspective even because he grew up for a time in Indonesia. This is a different kind of look at it, and it touches on something that you mentioned in your question, which is that who we are as an American people has shifted, so that if we were comparing it back to the civil rights era, you would have, about 10% of the population being black, 90% or so being white. Well, now the largest minority group is the Latino group, and then you have blacks. But also you have to take into account Asians, Native Americans, and the rest, so it's about a third of the population of the country made up of people of color. That's unprecedented again. And again, it allows people, I think, greater association with people of color. It allows a larger middle class, more political power, more expression of ideas that cross racial lines, everything from culture, from music to movies and the like. And then all of a sudden you can have the possibility of a Barack Obama. I don't think he could exist in the country as it was constructed before, but now with this new demographic, he's possible.
I have a follow-up on Ron's question. As a political scientist myself, in studying the history of this country, we had that terrible court case, the Dred Scott case, that indicated African Americans were property rather than human. And then we had Plessy v. Ferguson that supported segregation. And as you've referred to, Brown was reversing this. And we've had the great civil rights legislation, particularly in 64, 65. And I'm thinking of, as you've already mentioned, like Secretaries of State, Rice and Powell and Albright is the first woman Secretary of State, and we got this long list of progress, and we had the first very successful woman candidate for president in Hillary Clinton and also Mr. Obama. And so I say all that to indicate, as I do oftentimes in my work in civil rights, that that's great progress. But Mr. Williams, I also believe, and I get your reaction to my comment more than a question, and that is, but don't we still have a ways to go in dealing with gender issues and racial issues and age and disability, although we've had this progress? I guess sometimes what I worry about is that sometimes people may think we've arrived, and don't we still have problems and challenges that deal with prejudice and bigotry?
Oh, of course. Tony, the way I think of it is we've made so much progress that it's inspirational in terms of our need to continue to make progress. It's not, therefore, an invitation to sit down and say the game's over. But you stop and you look at some of the indicators and you say, oh my gosh, look at the difference in the economic status, look at the difference in unemployment rate, look at the difference in terms of graduation rates, and something becomes quite apparent that we still have widespread disparities in terms of racial groups in the country. And that's a huge problem because, when you understand how racial tensions arise or why people have different attitudes or different politics, so often I think we are quick to say, oh, it's a blacks versus white, or the Latinos have their issue, or it's kind of interest group politics, without paying attention to who's getting an education, who has economic opportunity. Why is it that the poverty rate among blacks is 25% and the poverty rate among whites is only 8%? You can imagine that's going to have a tremendous impact on a person's life, on who they associate with, their ability to have a house. So much goes into something like that, such a structural issue. So, I don't think there's any question that we have come a long way in this country. In fact, I saw the other day there was an article that suggested that we didn't appreciate how much progress was made in the 80s for minority groups in this country in terms of high school and college graduation rates, and therefore progress into the middle class. That, to me, is key. Again, we come back to something like Barack Obama, but as you touched on, you could talk about Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, and these are people of achievement, I think widely positively viewed in American life by people of all colors. these are possibilities that exist when you have this larger black middle class that is not only more economically secure, but more politically secure. But I think the other end of this comes to this, Tony. People might say, oh, well, if you could have a black person as the Democratic Party nominee or possibly president of the United States, does that mean that all racial issues now are gone? And again, I would say, no. I mean, that's like saying that because Hillary Clinton is there, that there's no issue for women in American society. And we know that women still, not only do they labor under disparities in terms of pay rates, but of course they have different sets of issues and oftentimes family issues that are very complicated for women in this society. And you have to have sort of a vigilance, or sort of keep your eyes on the prize, to quote the title of a book.
Yeah. You know, that title, I've heard it used by so many people in the Northwest. It's a very effective
I see it all the time on the sports page.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, hey, you should send me a dime for every time you use it.
Well, you're going down in history with having that great phrase, Virginia.
Well, speaking of a long ways to go, I'm going to make a pitch for another one of your books called Enough, with the subtitle, The Phony Leaders, Dead End Movements, and Culture of Failure That Are Undermining Black America and What We Can Do About It. And I know from this book that you begin the book by talking about a really controversial speech by the famous Bill Cosby in 2004, where he challenged people of color about their language, their unemployment, their jail time, their parenting, their illegitimate children. And I'm just curious, I'm not asking you to summarize this whole book in 2 minutes, but could you perhaps summarize a bit your response to Bill Cosby's speech, how that started your thinking and led to this book?
Sure, Virginia. You know, what happened was I wasn't in Washington when he gave the speech, and Tony and I were talking earlier about the Brown decision. Mm-hmm. Well, it was the 50th anniversary of the Brown decision in 2004, and Cosby was called upon by the NAACP to deliver some, I think, pleasant remarks as a celebrity, a comedian, but instead gave a very serious speech in which he talked about the fact that, and this is such a troubling and unsettling statistic, 70% of black children today are born out of wedlock, born to single moms. It's about 50% of the Hispanic children and about a quarter of the white children in the country now. These are astounding numbers. If you were to go back, remember Pat Moynihan, who was giving advice to President Nixon back in the late 60s, when he said that you're going to see more family dysfunction and families breaking apart. People say, oh, why would you say that? That's alarmist and even racist to make these comments. But if he was to see even the rate in the white community today, it would be in keeping exactly with what he predicted was going to happen. And the idea that it's 70% in the black community, he wouldn't have dreamed of saying such a thing. So that was part of what Cosby was speaking to. Let's talk about root problems that exist in the black community. And he wasn't talking so much about all blacks, Virginia, as the poor black community. So we're talking about not only the poverty rate that we touched on before, 25%, high out-of-wedlock birth rate, which contributes to poverty because therefore you don't have two adults earning income or there to support and nurture that child. But also then you're talking about things like the dropout rate. If you don't nurture that child and the child gets to school, is not prepared to learn really, less success in school, the so-called achievement gap between blacks and whites, and then at the other end, the absolute measure, graduation rates, when you see this awful number, 50% dropout rate among the black and Latino kids in the country today, 2008, all the economic challenges globally, and how can they succeed if they drop out like that? So this is what Cosby chose to talk about, and my reaction was, wow, that's fascinating. I didn't see any news coverage of this. Instead, I saw that there were like little biting comments attacking Cosby for having made such a speech, saying that he was feeding ammunition to the far right wing, to the Rush Limbaughs and people who weren't interested in minorities and just wanted to castigate minorities, and that he was a self-hating black man and that he was a comedian who didn't understand the powers of racism. And so I thought, you know what, let's put some meat on the bone. Let's look at some of these issues and see exactly where he was wrong or what lies that Bill Cosby had told. And the fact is, he didn't tell any lies, but he sounded alarms that made so many people uncomfortable, and I think especially in the minority community, that speech, I think, continues to have power as we try to understand how we can make progress, to pick up on earlier themes, how we can continue to make progress to deliver on the promise of racial equality for all, but understanding that people have to be in position to help themselves, that you have to take responsibility for your own behavior in your own community. You can't simply be pointing fingers outside without taking account of exactly what you might be doing that's dysfunctional or hurting yourself. And let me just, I apologize for taking so long. You said I should answer quickly. But one of the things that absolutely kills me as a black dad is turning on the TV and you see these images of young black people that are so negative. Oh my gosh, it's like you've got to walk around looking like you're threatening or hypersexual or hyper-violent, and the girls are all dressed like they got to shake that thing and all that. And I think the image, of course, then in white minds is, oh, that must be black America, which is just ridiculous. But then secondly, what's really pernicious and damaging is the image that it puts into the minds of young black people who think, oh, I've got to dress and act like this in order for other people to see me as genuinely black and proud of who I am, and that's my culture. Well, that's not black culture. It is a perversion, I think, that is created out of this hip-hop. This is what I'm talking about when I say dysfunction. It's a perversion that's created, and it feeds an industry of young people, mostly young white people, who buy this music, who get off on it, who think they're rebelling against their parents and they're listening to something that's kind of edgy and dangerous. But it is so damaging in terms of self-image and helping young black people see themselves as full of potential to have a role in America, to be Barack Obama. I think that's why one way in which Barack Obama is so important. I think the idea that he stands up there as a father to those two young girls, as a husband to his wife, as a functional family, a positive, healthy image. I think that's a value in and of itself, politics aside.
Ron?
You sort of have spoken in particularly in this book about a need for sort of new generation of leaders, both in the black community and the country as a whole. And clearly going into a presidential election, the American public is looking for who really is equipped to deal with the issues we're facing as a society. So if you were to give advice to our listeners, our viewers, looking for what the characteristics from your years of covering politics and government, what the characteristics they should look for in a leader. Not specifically one candidate or another, but just the kind of characteristics you think make a strong leader.
Well, it varies from moment to moment. But what you see is that people who are willing to make tough decisions and who exhibit character of the kind that does not get caught up in the winds of the moment, and by winds of the moment I mean opinion polls for the most part. So if you think back to, for example, people like President Truman, whose ratings have risen constantly over the years, initially thought of without much respect by historians, much of it has to do with the fact that people think, he made tough decisions that needed to be made at the time, may not have been popular, but were in the best interest of the country. Similarly, you look at President Eisenhower, people had lots of questions about him on the race question, but you look at his appointments to the Supreme Court, you look at his actions through that period, especially in Little Rock, where he sends the 101st Airborne in to defend the rights of those 9 black children. And you say, my gosh, you know what? He really was making decisions that were not about his self-interest, not about getting reelected or getting a fellow Republican elected down the line, but in best interest of America as a whole, of our nation. You come forward yet again and, you start again with LBJ, understanding at some point, because of decisions he made, again with regard to race, that he was going to hurt the Democrats in the South for generations to come. He said that quite explicitly. So I think that on some level you have to look towards people who can be selfless. And in this campaign, John McCain has picked up on this. He has a slogan. It was all around the Republican Convention Hall in St. Paul, saying country first. Barack Obama picks up on this when he says, it's time for a change away from the kind of partisan gridlock and hardline politics that has paralyzed us and made us unable to deal with so many issues, ranging from immigration to financial collapse. So both of them, I think, are trying to portray themselves in this way because it is the key characteristic that you would say is what heralds, especially from the historical perspective, a leader that was worth his salt.
There's so many questions, and I wished I had 2 hours with you, at least, Mr. Williams. But one of your books that I indicated was Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary. And our young viewers, if they've not read a lot of history, would not know that he was the lead attorney in the Brown case and went to really make a name for himself, too, when he was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court and broke another ceiling there with that process. In your research and writing of the book, give us a couple of ideas about what kind of man Thurgood Marshall was and what kind of mark is he leaving on history.
This is so interesting because, You know, it's my experience too, Tony, that lots of young people don't even know who Thurgood Marshall is. And so you say, well, was the first black person on the Supreme Court, and they get that. But then, of course, as you just pointed out, they have no idea that all along he was, you know, the person who went overseas to argue with General MacArthur about the treatment of blacks in the military,
Right.
the person who was arguing against the use of restrictive covenants that kept women, blacks, Latinos from buying properties in the better neighborhoods in this country, the one who argued about the presence of all people on juries, making sure that everyone could serve as a juror. I could go on bus lines. We think about the Montgomery bus boycott and Dr. King, but we don't think, wait a minute, that was a legal case too, and it ends up in the U.S. Supreme Court, and who argues and wins that case? And it's Thurgood Marshall. So that's Thurgood Marshall as well. And when you think about Marshall in the modern context, again, so many of the arguments that we know about race in American society today, affirmative action, busing, preferential policies with regards to business and contracting, these are ideas that Marshall put in place and argued about as legal remedies to this history of discrimination in society. So he continues to have impact on us as we wrangle and try to figure out how do we eliminate these economic disparities, educational disparities that lead to divisions, racial divisions in American society.
One thing about history that's so fascinating is, you mentioned it with Truman and now with Thurgood Marshall, so many times during the heat of battle, this is not all understood, but as time passes, we really learn that they were giants in the public policy arena.
It's true. And again, willing to stand up for what they believe to be principled.
Yes. Virginia?
I'm going to ask you a question as an author, your role as an author, because I teach English, so I'm always interested on the creative process and talking to my students about that. And I noticed in at least a couple of the books that I have here that you took sort of the same approach in that as an overview of a larger movement of the civil rights movement and so on, you included a lot of personal stories. Eyes on the Prize and My Soul Looks Back in Wonder. How did you determine to get into the books that way?
Well, you know, I think, Virginia, it's easy reading. And my goal is to communicate. And so, you know, in your experience as a teacher trying to communicate with students but also get them engaged in the subject, there are a number of ways to do it. I think ideas is the ultimate goal, is to have young people be critical thinkers and have ideas in their mind and think for themselves, not to listen to me or anybody who they see on TV or hear on the radio, but to really think for themselves. So ideas would be the height. And then you think about events, that they're major historical events, and to have them able to analyze these events and see the forces at play. But on some level, it really begins with individuals. And that's why I tend to focus on individuals as I write, because I think we can relate to this person, that we can relate and think about walking in that person's shoes, understand the kind of insecurities that might, you know, can I do this, or is it allowed, or am I going to be successful or not? Am I going to be a goat or a hero? You know, all these things are going on in your mind. And you don't know at the time how it's going to play out because you're in some kind of historical context. I was speaking today at a high school here in Coeur d'Alene, and I was saying to the young people, oftentimes after I'd written Eyes on the Prize, I would talk to young people who'd say, oh, you know, I didn't understand what was going on in the 50s and 60s with regards to civil rights. I never dreamed that people would say that was the greatest social movement America had ever seen. And I think that they didn't understand that moment in history. So, you know, if I'm writing about individuals in Our Soul Looks Back in Wonder who are pretty much ordinary people, but do things like, one of my favorites is a woman who found herself as a result of an illness paralyzed, and she becomes active in creating laws that make for the disabled access ramps outside of buildings in our country, or buses that are fitted so people with wheelchairs can get on them. And you think, well, how did that happen? Where did that come from? Well, it comes from somebody who literally was flat on her back as a result of illness, but decided to become an activist on this point and then succeeded. And to me, that's just thrilling. You think to yourself, hey, wait a second, you can make a difference in this country. You can have a voice. That's the great thing about our country, about America. You can speak up, you can act, you can build coalitions, build political force, and make a difference.
As we go to Ron, I'll just add one footnote. It reminds me of the book, The Tipping Point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, you have to find, and sometimes it's an individual. And I think if you start with that individual, everybody then can, again, thinking of your students, Virginia, get engaged and see themselves in this story rather than the larger theoretical idea. Hopefully they get the idea down the line.
Ron, go ahead.
It's been said that journalism is the sort of first draft of history, and is both a historian or writer of books about history and a practicing journalist today. Do you approach how you work as a journalist as a result of your having written these books about historical times in our country?
I think I'm better informed, Ron. What I notice is that it's a real advantage to have that background as you go about trying to tell contemporary stories. One of the deficits, I think, I don't mean to be critical of my peers, but is that so often people are focused on the immediate story and they don't have a sense of what came before. So the kind of historical antecedent that led us to this moment. People, their attention span is short. We only have so much space in the newspaper or on the radio or on the TV to tell the story. So we're just focused on what happened at that moment. And then you get everybody offering their opinion about it, but it's very rare that anyone would go back and say, well, here's exactly where this issue is rooted in our society. So for me, it has made me a better journalist, I think. It's given me larger perspective and allowed me to tell stories in more context. And I think oftentimes what's missing in modern journalism is the context. We'll get the headline, we'll get the latest horse race numbers between the candidates, but we won't get the context that helps people to have a true sense of the importance or the understanding that should go with that story.
We're getting somewhat short on time, but I want you to leave a message with young people, if you would, Mr. Williams. We live in an area where the minority population is very small. In Idaho, it's very small. It's overwhelmingly over 90% Caucasian. And as young people are being educated, would you share with them why diversity and understanding cultural differences is so important in the world? It's coming in down the road in the United States, over half the population will be what are now considered minorities. So give them some advice on how to celebrate diversity.
Well, this is very important because, even I find in the black community, in the Latino community, there are young people who really want to celebrate their own identities and think, why do I have to relate to others, et cetera. But the fact is, once you get out into American society, whether you're in the military or in the corporate workforce, what you're going to find is a mix of people. The demographers used to talk about the melting pot. Now it's a salad bowl. Everybody's out there. You could have a Puerto Rican boss. You could have a black employee. And the key is, as a team, to succeed. So you want to be able to communicate well, inspire well. You want to have people understand you and understand common goals. That's what's critical. And so it's absolutely essential that you have the ability to see beyond yourself and know people who aren't like you, rather than to demonize or stigmatize the other. And that's so easy, especially here, right, where you have such a homogenous community, 90% white, as you just said. It's easy to say, oh, well, those are, that kind of people, or you get stereotypes that apply to people because you don't know people.
Right.
And so there's a danger in that. You think about what's happened in this community, the posse comitatus, that kind of thing. Those are real dangers. People can be fed the bread of hate very quickly. So it's important that you know real people. And it's not important just as a matter of conscience, and I would argue that that's important, being a faithful person, but it's also important as a matter of maintaining a healthy, stable, profitable community. That this community understand the value of diversity if it is to be part of this changing America.
On that note, from the conclusion, what a great note to end on, and thank you so much for
Tony,
that great advice.
To be with you.
And I want to thank Ron in Virginia. You've been wonderful. And Ron, again, we're so grateful. Idaho Public Television, you do great work in Idaho, and you bring our state together on all these great programs. And also, as chair of the Idaho Humanities Council, you're doing great work. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for being here with this interview with Mr. Williams, and thank you very much.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.